Hello, amazing visionaries. This is Lorna Liana, and welcome to the Modern Shamanism Mystery School, where we explore how we can apply ancient shamanic wisdom to our complex modern lives and evolve into the highest version of ourselves, becoming the visionary leaders that the world so urgently needs in these troubled times. In this week-long introduction to the world of visionary shamanism, we will explore sacred plant medicines, indigenous culture, dream work, expanded states of consciousness, mediumship, and spirit guides. So today I'm really excited to bring to you Jerry B. Brown, who I had the honor of meeting at the Psychedelic Science Conference in Oakland. Jerry is an anthropologist and co-author of a book called The Psychedelic Gospels, The Secret History of Hallucinogens in Christianity. From 1972 to 2014, he served as the founding professor of anthropology at Florida International University in Miami, where he taught a course on hallucinogens and culture. He's here with us today to talk about the history of psilocybin mushrooms in religion and spirituality around the world, as well as the psychedelic origins of Christianity. Thank you so much for joining us. I cannot wait to dive in.
Let's dive away, and thank you for all the great work, Lorna, that you're doing within Thea Nation.
Thank you, and you too. I'm so excited to hear a little bit about your journey on how you discovered that Christianity had possibly a psychedelic origin.
Certainly. Lily Tomlin, the comic, said something to the effect that reality is a crutch for people who can't handle psychedelics. Well, I certainly was not prepared to handle my first psychedelic experience, which took place back in 1973. It was Orange Sunshine, LSD, which I experienced at a Rainbow Family gathering high in the mountains of Colorado. I was in a very tumultuous time in my life, both personally and professionally, and it spun me out into a Carlos Castaneda-like world of power spots, paranoia, people who were not people. And at one point, I felt I was losing my mind, possibly losing my soul. And it wasn't as bad as that experienced by Albert Hofmann, the discoverer of LSD, in 1943 when he first experienced LSD, who thought he was actually dying. It didn't get that bad. But at that point, I realized that these were indeed the royal road to the psyche, extremely powerful. And I wanted to learn more, a lot more, about psychedelics. Being an anthropologist, I decided to design a course on psychedelics and culture, which I did, and I started teaching every year from 1975 on. It was an interdisciplinary course. I immersed myself in ethnobotany, in art history, in church history, in theology, in mycology. And it looked at both the ancient uses of psychedelics in classical cultures, such as the Hindu Rig Veda. It was the Soma of the Hindu Rig Veda. And also there was a psychedelic poshet, the Kikian, at the root of the Eleusinian mysteries that went on for 2,000 years, from 1500 BC until about 400, when Christianity became the official religion of the Catholic Church, and it was suppressed as paganism. And people can still visit the archaeological ruins of Eleusis outside of Athens today. It touched on the peyote cult hunt of the Huichol Indians of Mexico, the Conibos, ayahuasca shamanism deep in the Amazon. And it went all the way back into the archaeology of psychedelics, including psilocybin. And I'm going to show several pictures from our book. Here's the bee-headed mushroom shaman of Algeria that was drawn about 11,000 years ago, showing how ancient humanity's interaction with psilocybin is.
That's so adorable. It's like this mushroom man. He's completely covered in mushrooms.
Exactly. And so I'm teaching this course. I'm very familiar with psychedelics. And let's fast forward to 2006. My beloved wife and co-author, Julie M. Brown, I are on a anniversary trip to Scotland, and we decided to visit Rosslyn Chapel which we came to know about because in the bestseller, the movie, and the book, The Da Vinci Code, Rosslyn Chapel was seen as a possible resting place of the Holy Grail of the Virgin Mary. And so while touring that chapel, which is a Catholic church, but it is unique in Christendom in that it is an interesting fusion of Catholic and pagan symbolism. And there are over 100 green men heads sculpted and connected by a sinuous vine that goes throughout the chapel. Looking up in the sacred center of the chapel where the altars are for prayer, I noticed suspended from the ceiling on a 15-foot stone boss was this green man. And he is quite a sardonic figure looking out at us. There are vines growing out of his tear ducts, and he is covered by foliage. I was fascinated by this green man, and I bought a plaster replica. And 2 weeks later, when I was sitting in a restaurant, I turned it around and found a replica of an Amanita muscaria mushroom, which was the Soma of the Hindu Rig Veda, which is used in reindeer herder shamanism throughout Siberia, sculpted upside down in the forehead. And this got me to thinking, what was Sir William Sinclair, who designed and created Rosslyn and oversaw everything that was in the church, what was he trying to tell us? Was there a role of psychedelic mushrooms in medieval Christianity? Did it go back as far as early Christianity? Could it even be that Jesus and the disciples used psychedelics and sacred plants were the way in which they became aware of their divinity, of their immortality? At this point, as our minds, Julie and mine, were racing towards what I call the rambunctious overthrow of reason, we reflected on Carl Sagan, the astrophysicist's famous words: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And if we were going to propose something as controversial as the idea that Christianity had a psychedelic history, then we better go out and collect incontrovertible evidence of psychedelics in Christian art. And it was from that experience, that was the catalyst that led in 2012 to our research journey through Europe and the Middle East. By the way, when I was writing the book, Julie and I had the honor of having dinner with Paul Stamets, one of the world's most eminent mycologists. And I said, Paul, do you agree that this is an Amanita muscaria mushroom? And he said, oh, yes, it is. And I'm somewhat embarrassed about this because I said, Paul, are you sure? It's like kind of asking the Pope, are you Catholic? And he pulled out his computer and he said, that's a taxonomically correct Amanita muscaria mushroom. And let me show you the other psychedelic images I found at Rosslyn. By the way, this is a photograph of Amanita muscaria through the various stages of its development, which is also found in our book. So we set out to do this research journey through Europe, and we went to various sites that are highlighted here in France, in Germany, in Italy, in certainly in Turkey and in England. And everywhere we went, in the 9 churches, cathedrals, abbeys, tiny chapels we visited, we found compelling evidence of psychedelics in Christian art.
Wow, that is intriguing. So, okay, so that's fascinating that he actually saw that shape as being taxonomically correct. Because my first thought is like, okay, it's kind of a mushroom shape, but maybe it's a bit of a stretch. So, what were some of the other psychedelic references he found in the chapel? Do you recall from that conversation?
Oh yeah, surely. But on that point, it showed the various stages of the Amanita. It showed the bowl. It showed the veil, which is the Amanita appears and it's covered in a white veil, and that peels back, leaving the little white dots on the red cap. But there is, as it tears away, a veil around the stem of the mushroom. And then there is obviously the spotted top. Now, it's hard to draw a mushroom or to sculpt a mushroom completely accurately, but his view was it is a taxonomically correct Amanita muscaria, depicting the life cycle of the Amanita. So based on that and on this whole catalyst of Rosslyn, and Paul showing us other psychedelic mushroom images, both cutaways and full mushroom images in Rosslyn, and additional research we did, in 2012, we went out to collect the evidence of psychedelics in Christian art. And by that I mean in frescoes, in stained glass windows, in illuminated Bibles and prayer books, in mosaics, and in a variety of, and in sculpture, such as we found in Rosslyn Chapel, and I'd be happy to share with you some of those images.
So do you think it was the Amanita muscaria mushroom that the early Christians were consuming? And I ask this because, I've never eaten this mushroom. I'd heard they could be kind of toxic. So, as a psychedelic mushroom goes, it tends to not be the top of the list of what people want to consume to have a really great magic mushroom trip.
Yeah. We found evidence, as I'll show you visually in a few minutes, of both prominent Amanita muscaria mushrooms and of several varieties of psilocybin mushrooms in the Christian art. We found both well represented and well depicted and well drawn. I have personally experienced Soma, and I found it to be a very powerful psychoactive substance. There are no known deaths from Amanita muscaria because of the taboo, and this goes all the way back to the eventual suppression after the Inquisition of our entheogenic history in Western culture, that we kind of lost that tradition, and Amanita muscaria got to be depicted as taboo, as a tool of witches, and as something that needed to be avoided at all costs. In fact, in mushroom guides, you will find, even today, you'll find some of that description. But Amanita muscaria has been used by time immemorial by the reindeer herding people, the nomadic reindeer herding people. They're not digital nomads, they're reindeer nomads who are found in Siberia, in central Russia today, and in Scandinavia. And they're known as the fathers of shamanism, and they still practice it today. In fact, our modern myth of Santa Claus goes back to the Amanita shamanic practices of the reindeer herding people. So there's a long tradition of it. In fact, these are the people who migrated out of Central Eurasia, came into the Indus Valley, and inspired the Hindu Rig Veda, the oldest of the Hindu texts, written down in the Sanskrit from an oral tradition about 3,500 years ago, that has an incredibly famous passage. We have drunk Soma and become immortal. We have attained the light and the gods discovered. Now what can foeman's malice do to harm us? Oh, immortal Soma. This was studied in a masterpiece by Gordon Wasson called Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality. So we have found evidence of both in Christian art.
So
psychedelic,
do we know
psilocybin and Amanita muscaria.
Okay, so do we know that the reference to Soma refers specifically to Amanita muscaria, or is that a theory?
It's a well-established theory. There have been many candidates. Look, when the Rig Veda, which is a masterwork of human civilization, got translated into the German and the French and English about 200 years ago, people were mystified because Soma was praised. It was a plant, but it was a strange plant. It had no bark. It had no leaves. It had no trunk. It had no visible seeds. And it was praised as a god, a plant, and the juice of the plant by the ancient Hindus. But people, they knew what it was, but people could not figure out what it was until R. Gordon Wasson, using an interdisciplinary approach and using only the tools and the language of the Rig Veda itself, made the compelling argument that it is the Amanita muscaria mushroom. And to me, one of the most ethnobotanical, compelling pieces of this article, you have passages where Indra comes and it says, here is Indra, come pissing out Soma like a stag, pissing it out day by day. You have assumed your most mighty force, and you think, yuck. And why is this? Because the ebotenic acid and the muscimol, which are the psychoactive agents in Amanita muscaria, and the ebotenic converts from muscimol, are unlike other psychedelics, whether it be DMT, whether it be psilocybin, whether it be from the peyote, the mescaline in the peyote, metabolized fairly easily through the body. Muscimol does not metabolize, and it passes out through the urine. So you have reports of reindeer herder shaman coming out of their ecstasy and people in their village holding out their cups and drinking their urine. And they will then go on a shamanic experience. In fact, the reindeer are crazy about human urine, just as they're crazy about Amanita muscaria. We have a whole chapter in our book called Santa, the Reindeer Shaman. So it certainly is not only from my own personal experience, but well documented throughout human history. And I think Gordon Wasson has made a compelling argument identifying Soma as Amanita muscaria. In fact, that was the first image that when we were traveling, Julie and I, in central France, in the tiny church of Plaincarral, that we saw was of a giant Amanita muscaria mushroom from about the 12th century.
So going back to the reindeer herders, so help me clarify. Was it the reindeer that ate the Amanita muscaria and then the shamans that drank the reindeer pee? Or was it the shamans that ate the Amanita muscaria and then everyone, including the reindeer, drank the shaman pee?
Okay, well said. Both. It was both. First of all,
everyone's drinking each other's pee.
We know half of Wasson's book are the translation of the documents. He translated documents of adventurers, soldiers of fortune, prisoners up in Siberia through hundreds of years who saw and witnessed reindeer herder shamanism among the Oshchuk, among the Vogel, among the Koryak, among the Kamachka, in the Kamachka Peninsula, very close to Alaska. And they witnessed people actually holding out their cups and drinking the urine of the shaman. In addition, the shaman reindeer love Amanita muscaria. In fact, in this chapter on Santa the reindeer herder, Julie and I visited in the highlands of Scotland the Cairngorms Mountains Reindeer Center, which is where you find a herd of wild reindeer. And what the guides told us is the reindeer love Amanita muscaria, and they gorge themselves on it in season. In fact, there was one reindeer named Circus, who was his skin was pink and white blotched, and we say, what's the matter with him? And he said, he is like the Timothy Leary of reindeer. He gorges himself on Amanita when they're in season, and he stands there gazing into the sun, which they tell you never to do. So certainly it was both. And the shamans and the reindeer herders they carry little reindeer herder bags made out of reindeer skin filled with urine to attract the reindeer from their nomadic tribe. So there's a long history. What's also interesting, why the fathers of shamanism? Because think about it. Think about Mesoamerica. Think about the use of entheogens and the search for entheogens throughout Mesoamerica. Who are these people? These were the people who migrated out of Eurasia 12 to 40,000 years ago when there was a land bridge and the Ice Age, and there was a land bridge from Siberia into the Americas. They brought with them this Soma worshiping religion. When they lost access to Soma, which grows 6,000 to 8,000 feet, or in the cold areas, this was such an important part of shamanism because these plants provided a portal into the supernatural world.
So
let me just finish that thought. That when they lost access to Amanita muscaria, they searched for other substitutes to continue their shamanistic practices. Peyote is very bitter, but they ate the bitter peyote and they found the huichol, found it for their use. The bufotenin in Bufo moraeus frogs can be toxic, but the Veracruzano Indians figured out how to dilute it and use it in the shamanic practices. And as you well know, the ayahuasca of the Amazon required early chemists to combine two plants in order for a person to be able to not inhibit the ayahuasca, the DMT uptake, but to experience it. So this is why the reindeer herders are the fathers of shamanism.
Interesting. So when you consumed Amanita muscaria, did you eat the mushroom directly, or were you drinking the shamanic pee?
Directly.
And what is the difference between the experience being on Amanita mushrooms versus psilocybin mushrooms?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I've been asked that several times. And I can't really comment on that because my feeling and my experience is everyone has different experiences, even with the same substances. It depends on certainly what is the mental set that you bring to the experience. What is the setting in which you're standing? Are you at some peaceful location on the tranquil turquoise ocean shores of Jamaica? Are you standing on 57th and Broadway in New York? And the last part is, what is your psychological state at the time? My first LSD experience was a frightening, horrific one because I was in tremendous turmoil in my life. And this psychomimetic brought it all out into a full-blown crisis. When I had one of the two most powerful psilocybin experiences in my life, I was in a very grounded place. I was in a tranquil, I was on the shores of Jamaica, near Negril, Jamaica. And I, like you, got a powerful divine message about what my work should be, what my mission here should be. So I think it can't be described generically. What is the difference between Amanita muscaria, muscimol, and psilocybin? It really depends on so many factors.
Mm-hmm. So going back to Christianity then, so you found many references to psychoactive mushrooms in the art. I'm curious to know if you were able to match that up with any mention in Christian literature because, well, I'm not like a Christian scholar, but it doesn't seem like there's, a lot of conversation around this in Sunday school.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very good question. Let me start with the Christian art, and then let me come back to the Gospels, and the Gnostic Gospels, because when you revisit them, no matter how many times you've read them, through the eyes of the psychedelic Gospels, there are passages that flame out, that illuminate, and that are very plausible references, even from the mouth of Jesus, to entheogenic substances in the language of the time. Let's start out with the art, because this is not simply, Lorna, references in the art. This is direct art. This is from the fresco painted on the walls of the tiny chapel of Plain Carrault in central France. And I mean tiny. It's 20 feet wide and 60 feet deep. And on the asp in the back of the church is this Eden scene. And what you can see there are Adam and Eve, and they're standing side by side around a giant Amanita muscaria mushroom, which has on the top, very meticulously drawn, the white spots. They are also, as Julie and I found, because we saw this mushroom and photographed it, and these are all Julie's photographs up close and personal, they are covering themselves not with fig leaves, but with mushroom caps. And Eve is skeletonized, which is and Adam is also partially skeletonized, which is a direct reference to shamanism, because the perseverance of the bones, of the human bones, and the use of bones as relics is very important in shamanism. This was our first major evidence. It had been part of the debate between Gordon Wasson and John Allegro about the presence of psychedelics in Christian art. And the fact was that Pope Gregory in the 6th century said, let art be the Bible of the illiterate, because the vast majority of the population, all through the Gutenberg printing press of the Middle Ages, were illiterate. So the Pope is saying, let's make our message come out through the Bible. So it's most likely to be there in the art. We drove 2 hours from Plain Corral to the tiny parish church of St. Martin de Vic, created by Benedictine monks about the 12th century. And we entered the choir, and the colors were, even today, after 1,000 years, still stunning. And here was a Christology. The life of Christ was depicted. And here's a very famous scene from the New Testament, Christ's entry into Jerusalem. And we see that here, the joyful youth who are greeting Jesus as he comes into Jerusalem are holding on to the stems of 5 tan, large psilocybin mushrooms. Julie saw these first, and she said, "Do you see what I see?" And I said, "Oh yes, now I see what you see." If that were not enough, that on the next wall, perpendicular, Christ is moving towards the towers of Jerusalem, and there the youth are cutting down with long knives psilocybin mushrooms from the Tower of Jerusalem. And this scene is right over an image of the Last Supper, where you have Jesus and the disciples. These are mushroom caps, not bread. If it were bread, these would be loaves and they would be torn apart, with the knives that were used to cut them down from the towers on the table. And if you look closely, in the hems of the disciples, the artist has skillfully drawn 4 psilocybin mushroom caps. All of this can be found in the color plates. These are original photographs of our book, The Psychedelic Gospel.
So they're not bowls or plates. They look like they could be bowls or plates. No?
Those are not bowls or plates. Those
okay.
When you look at the fringe of them, those are not bowls or plate. And when you put that all together, those are not palm leaves that the youth are holding on to. They're holding on to psilocybin mushrooms. Those are not palm leaves that they're cutting down from the towers of Jerusalem. Those are psilocybin mushrooms. Very clear and distinct. Again, large, because size matters in Romanesque art. And the depiction of the mushroom shapes in the hems of the disciples, the knives on the table, and the shape of cut up psilocybin caps on the table. At this time, it was late in the afternoon. The light was kind of muted. The church bell rang, and Julie and I kind of felt we were being transported back into medieval times. And it was, Lorna, at that moment that we had our aha moment. There's a psychedelic gospels that we're witnessing here unfolding before us as we travel throughout Europe. This is an alternative story to the master story that we've learned in Christianity. And I can give you a few other very dramatic examples of it in Christian art, which I'd like to do.
Sure. Yeah. Do you have more art to show us?
I do. We said to ourselves, and we kept checking ourselves along this journey. We said to ourselves, okay, we've now found Amanita muscaria mushrooms in one chapel. We found psilocybin mushrooms in an abbey and a chapel in central France. So what's going on here? Are these renegade priests cavorting far from the crown and the king in the forests of France? Are these hippie priests with a marginal cult? We had to go to the high holy places of Christendom to see if in these icons of Christianity we could find psychedelic mushroom images. We went to Chartres Cathedral, and we found in the magnificent 176 stained glass windows, 2 tiers of them in Chartres Cathedral, we found mushroom images in nearly 10% of all of the stained glass windows in Chartres. We went to Canterbury Cathedral, which is home of the great Canterbury Psalter. And this is an image from the Canterbury Psalter from Genesis, which is on the cover of our book, the Psychedelic Gospels. And in the third image of Genesis, where God creates plants, God's not creating plants, he's creating psychoactive mushrooms. The red and white Amanita muscaria, the blue psilocybin, because as we know, psilocybin and psilocin turns blue when it is oxidized, and two other varieties of psilocybin mushrooms.
Those definitely look like mushrooms.
We went to Hildesheim in Germany. In most of these cases, we don't know who made that art. Was it the priests who oversaw it? Was it the artisans who slipped it into the artwork? Was it the patrons, the pagan royalty who financed these churches? But at St. Michael's Church in Hildesheim, Germany, we know exactly who made the art. It was Bishop Bernard, who was prominent. He was the tutor to Otto III, the Holy Roman Emperor, for many years. He became a bishop at an early age, and after he died, dedicating his life as a church builder and to the church, he became sainted by the Catholic Church. He was a mathematician, he was a church builder, he was a metallurgist, and he had two bronze legacies cast. One was a gigantic door, 13 foot high, on Hildesheim at St. Michael's Church, which depicted from the Garden of Eden to the mission of Jesus. Again, Amanita muscaria mushroom. And in a Christ column, which is a bronze cast over 12 feet high and almost 3 feet in diameter, in a double helix around this Christ column is the life of Christ from his baptism by John to his entry into Jerusalem. And here is a scene from the transfiguration of Christ, which is one of two unique scenes in the Bible where a miracle actually happens to Jesus as opposed to him performing a miracle. The ancient biblical icons appear, and his disciples are nearby under a psilocybin mushroom cap. Here is where God intersects with humanity and speaks and says, "This is my son. Hear him well." So these are liberty cap mushrooms. They are so precisely drawn that ethnobotanists have been able to tell what variety they are. And so these and the other images which are in our book, which have been verified by ethnobotanists, gave us enough extraordinary evidence to proclaim what we're seeing here is a psychedelic gospel. What we're seeing here is an alternative history of Christianity. Now, there is no Christian art before the year 200. We found artwork in mosaics of Amanita muscaria back in the Cathedral of Aquileia in Italy from 300 AD. But because of horrible persecution, because of poverty, because you need buildings and institutions to create art, there was no early Christian art. So what we did is, with our psychedelic gospel eyes, we reread the Gospels of the New Testament, and we went into the Gnostic Gospels as well. And we looked at passages familiar to so many people, like in John, in the Gospels, where Jesus says something to the effect, "Whoever eateth of my flesh and drinketh of my blood hath eternal life, and I shall raise him on the last day." Now, is Jesus asking people to be cannibals? We don't think so. This would be repugnant to Romans and Jews, and all the early Christians were Jews alike. We believe this is a metaphor for consuming the sacred plant, for consuming entheogens that gave Jesus and the disciples a direct experience and connection to the divinity. In the Gnostic Gospels, and the Gnostics were suppressed by the official Catholic Church over the years after the coming and crucifixion of Christ, there's an incredible passage in the Gospel of Thomas. And Jesus says to his disciples, "Compare me to someone and tell me whom I'm like." And Thomas says, "Master, I cannot tell you who you are like. My tongue is incapable of comparing you to anyone." And Jesus says, and I quote, "I am not your master. Because you have drunk, You have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring, which I have measured forth. He who will drink from my mouth will become like me. I shall become like he, and the things that are hidden will be revealed to him. Now, this is obviously a sacred drink, this bubbling spring, and Jesus is talking in his own terms about a dose, which I have measured out. We know how important dosage is to experience. And now they merge together in a transpersonal experience, and the kingdom of heaven is within. All of these things that are hidden are revealed. So we cite in our chapter on the kingdom of heaven these passages from the Bible, especially the New Testament and the Gnostic Gospels, that can provide plausible evidence of the use of entheogens all the way back to the time of Jesus and the disciples.
Wow. So that is certainly very intriguing. And I remember a passage out of Ezekiel that was completely psychedelic. I actually illustrated it as a part of an art project for a religious studies class. But yeah, I feel like I have a new appreciation for some of the mystical experiences that are described in the Bible. So, bringing us back to, I guess, the current our current era. Jerry. Now that you know these things, I'm curious to know, like, in addition to, well, just having an intriguing new perspective on Christianity, how can this knowledge serve us now?
Oh, certainly, to be sure. First of all, I think we need to look at what the role of psychedelics in shamanism and religion are. And the classical definition in anthropology of shamanism is provided by the Greek anthropologist Mircea Eliade. And he describes it as archaic techniques of ecstasy, drawing on the Greek root word of ekstasis for motion. So archaic techniques for the flight of the soul. Archaic techniques for the flight of the soul. And universally in shamanism, both ancient and modern, and for anyone going to explore the mystical geography of the underworld and upper world that shamans through time immemorial have evolved. Universally, shamanism, there's a natural world, and then there's the supernatural world, the underworld, the upper world, where the spirits, the gods, the ancestors, the goddesses reside. And much like Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, the role of the shaman is to use his initiatory knowledge and his experience in this sacred landscape to travel to that world and to bring back a boon to his community, whether it be rains, whether it be a good hunt, whether it be warding off evil spirits, whether it be helping someone reclaim their soul, and whether it be healing, which shamanism was used profoundly and is still used today in healing. And so it is no wonder that sacred plants, which provide that portal into this supernatural geography, would be worshipped, revered, and have a central role, not in all shamanic practices, but in many of the contemporary shamanic practices, whether it be ibogaine among the Fang of Central Africa, whether it be Picori among the Australian Aborigines, whether it be ayahuasca through many of the indigenous tribes of Brazil and the Peruvian and the Ecuadorian Amazon, whether it be peyote among the Huichol, and certainly psilocybin among the Mazatec Indians of the state of Oaxaca. In fact, there is an interesting correlation there, because Maria Sabina, who is one of the most famous Mazatec wise women and shamans, perhaps the most famous shaman of the 20th century, there have been documentaries about her. Her life story was transcribed, her oral history, down in the Mazatec and translated into Spanish. her initiation into shamanism, and we understand that in the indigenous world, people are called to shamanism through various ways. It might be they become horribly sick and need to follow the shamanic path to heal themselves or seek out the counsel of shamans. It may be they have an initiation and receive a powerful message that takes them on a shamanic journey. It may be, as in parts of rural Mexico, where if you're almost struck by lightning, it's a sign that you are being called to shamanism. For Maria Sabina, she came from a long line of Mazatec, male and female shamans of the first order, not sorcerers, not people who cured with herbs, but people through whom the mushroom spoke. And the words of the mushroom guided her healing. In fact, and her magnificent chants, some of which are in our book, The Psychedelic Gospels, at the end of every sentence, she says in Mazatec, mushroom says, because she knows it is not her speaking. It is the sentient, wise mushroom who've been here for millennia, who are speaking through her. Her sister had stomach cramps. She was dreadfully ill. She was bleeding profusely. Maria Sabina was afraid she would die. Her sister would die. And she and her sister had seen people ingesting these psychedelic mushrooms, the landslide mushrooms, around their village in Huautla de Jimenez in Oaxaca. And she decided she consumed 30 pairs of the landslide mushroom, where 4 to 6 might be considered a mega journey. At that point, she heard the voice of a loving father, and I quote, these people appeared before her, and the loving voice said, these are the principal ones. On the table in front of her, in the front of the principal ones, was an open book. It was growing to the size of a person. And Maria Sabina said, the book was before me. I could see it, but I could not touch it. I tried to caress it, but my hands didn't touch anything. I limited myself to contemplating it. And at that moment, I began to speak. And then I realized I was reading the book of the sacred language, my book, the book of the principal ones. I had attained perfection. And we cite all of this in our book from her autobiography. And this was her initiation. And from that point on, she dedicated her life to healing and guiding and providing mushroom veladas with psilocybin to the people in her village, and eventually to, unfortunately, Westerners who inundated Huautla de Jimenez after her image got on the cover, or her story got into Life magazine way back in 1955.
I remember watching a video clip about the life of Maria Sabina, and that one of her deepest regrets, she had passed away actually penniless. And at the same time, while in the beginning she was happy about the interest of outsiders in the Niños Santos, towards the end of her life, she regretted the impact that interest had on her community, and she felt that the power of the mushrooms had dissipated because people were not using the mushrooms in a sacred way. But interestingly enough, and I enjoyed the way that this video clip ended. The video also showed the current scientific research on the potential, medical and therapeutic applications of psilocybin mushrooms. And so for the first time, probably after, maybe 50 years or so, where there was a complete prohibition lockdown, science is now, actually doing clinical research into the efficacy of psilocybin to treat a number of different conditions. And so we are, for the first time, exploring how these mushrooms can be used for healing, and that ties back to Maria Sabina's original desire or intent, that is what they're used for and not for recreation.
Absolutely. And the cycle, the strange journey of, and a strange interaction of entheogens with humanity has taken many different turns. Certainly what happened in the 1960s was that there had been a lot of research and academic and scholarly and medical research into psychedelics throughout the 40s and the 50s. There were over 2,000 professional papers published documenting research on over 40,000 human subjects. All of this got forgotten and washed away in the repression that came in part after Timothy Leary got onto the world stage as the kind of circus barker for psychedelics, and many researchers were very disappointed. But for a variety of reasons, in 1970, Nixon passed the Controlled Substances Act, which scheduled most of the known psychedelics as Schedule 1. No possible value even for human or research allowed into human subjects. So all of this history got washed away, both the indigenous history and the actual high quality medical research. And those papers are still there today that have been done in the 40s and 50s. That taboo ended in 1999 when Roland Griffiths, a psychopharmacologist with over 300 professional peer-reviewed papers at Johns Hopkins University, got permission from the FDA or the National Institutes of Mental Health to conduct research on psilocybin. He conducted, and other studies were done at NYU, on the use of psilocybin with terminally ill cancer patients who, as you can imagine, were depressed and had tremendous anxiety. And he found that psilocybin, even 1 or 2 sessions, in 80% of the subjects had an efficient and a dramatic impact. It shifted their fear of death. It gave them a new perspective on the tapestry of their life, to the extent that he is now touting this as a treatment for drug and alcohol dependence, for depression, and for cancer anxiety. And I want to quote Griffiths here because he is a modern shaman in a way, but a scientifically grounded shaman. Remember, these are all done in clinical psychedelically assisted psychotherapy sessions. He says, there is something at the core of this experience, and he's talking about the psilocybin experience, that opens people up to the great mystery of what we don't know. He says there is a buoyancy that comes from this experiences that is quite remarkable. To see people who've been so beaten down by cancer, and after this session, they start actually providing reassurance to their caretakers and the people, their family who love them most, telling them, it's okay, I'm good, there's no need to worry, I'm at peace. When a dying person, and I continue to quote Roland Griffiths, can provide that type of clarity for their caretakers, even we researchers are left with a sense of wonder.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. What I find the most compelling around on the recent research that's been done into psilocybin mushrooms are the promising results around the treatment of depression. Do you know much about the results of these studies?
I actually do. And my wife, Julie, who is a psychonaut, a very well experienced psychonaut, a psychotherapist who has done psychotherapy, licensed mental health counselor, did psychotherapy, mainly working on women's issues and working with cancer patients for 30 years when we lived in Miami, has tremendous insight into not only how it works, because we know that from the Johns Hopkins and the NYU studies, but why it works. Part of this answer comes from the phenomenal research that Dr. Robin Carhart Harris's group is doing with neuroimaging at the Imperial College in London. For example, you heard that old shibboleth from the Reagans in the 1970s. This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs, and it shows you the scrambled eggs. Well, right out of the research on healthy human subjects, both before and after they've taken, in this case, LSD, and I'll get to psilocybin in a minute. This is your brain, and this is your brain on LSD.
Ooh, what pretty pretty colors. I like my brain on LSD.
Exactly. So this is a neural imaging of that state of ecstatic expansion, where everything is a divine dance of comedy and love that many people have experienced. This is what's going on in your brain. Areas and chambers of your brain that we do not use in the default everyday network are illuminated. This is why psychedelics have proven so important in creativity. In fact, Steve Jobs loved LSD. He said it was one of the 2 or 3 most important experiences in his life that allowed him to think different in creating Apple. And there are other scientists who've had creative breakthroughs, and there's a whole area of psychedelics for problem solving. Now, here is from Cahart's group again, an image of the neural pathways of the brain before and after. And what we see here is that the brain uses various circuits, or what we could call information highways. In the normal default mode network, only a few of those highways are being traveled. There's not a lot of cars on that road. But under psilocybin and other psychedelics, the traffic goes into these unused areas. Julie's theory is that the psilocybin interrupts and disrupts creatively the self-absorbed, closed-loop thinking so pronounced in depressed people, making the way and opening the avenue for mystical experience. And what we are describing here are major shifts of awareness where a person can now come from not a place of fear and contraction, but of expansion, self-love, and empowerment to heal themselves.
Great. There's so much that we can discover too. And, bringing it back to Christianity, one of the things that, I had always wondered, and I'm sure, is something that is, discussed too within the psychedelic, world as well, is like why certain drugs are legal and others are not. And so alcohol is a big one. Alcohol is actually considerably more, bad for it's considerably more harmful to health than psilocybin mushrooms. And people die from alcohol overdose, whereas there is no known death from a magic mushroom overdose. I mean, there might be death from accidents like heavy machinery, of course, but just from consuming too much of it. I mean, chances are you'll probably throw up first before you die. But with alcohol, there's it's really bad, for your body. People do die of overdoses, and the thing that struck me is I think probably the reason why the Western world has a much easier time accepting alcohol is because it's part of its culture and the religion. In Christianity, there's the whole the serving of the wine at gosh, it's been so long since I've been to church. Serving of wine and bread, Eucharist, and so so if we maybe embraced the presence of magic mushrooms in Christianity, I wonder whether or not that allows us to then accept a possible pathway to legalization of psilocybin mushrooms too. And I do know that there's a couple states that are really pushing for it, and it might actually be possible.
Yes, definitely. There are the city of Denver is looking at legalizing. There's going to be an initiative on the ballot in Oregon next year for psilocybin services that would allow the use of psilocybin in psychedelically assisted psychotherapy. There may be a psychedelic therapy center opening up in a neighborhood near you in Oregon in the not too distant future. And there are also other initiatives. Look, we have seen that legalization follows medicalization in the whole area of cannabis. And I think the same thing will certainly happen in the area of psychedelics if we do not make the mistakes that were made in the 1960s that provoke a backlash in the media, which has been very favorable in its coverage of the medical uses and research on psychedelics. The other thing that's important here is that, one, these substances do create a psychedelic mystical experience. The point I wanted to make was, okay, this would be all well and good, Lorna, that these are legalized for clinical medical purposes. But what about you and I? What about the millions of people who've done LSD? What about the seekers today who, some of them seeking, they're spiritual but not religious, and they're seeking alternative pathways, some through meditation, some through service, some through chanting, and certainly some through psychedelics. Do not we have a right to explore these for religious purposes as a First Amendment right of the Constitution of the United States, as a human right under the European Declaration of Human Rights? And that's what Julie and I have argued in the conclusion of our book, The Psychedelic Gospels. We argued for the creation of sacred centers, much as existed at Eleusis in ancient Greece, where people could come in a safe and beautiful setting with the availability of trained guides if they needed them, with screening so people who were emotionally fragile and completely unstable would not go into these experiences, where people could legally explore these for creativity, for personal growth, for spiritual and religious purposes. We think this was the original Eucharist, and we do not think it is contradictory to the Christian tradition. We hope a dialogue will open. And as one of the people who've endorsed our book, Brother David Stendhal Rast, a Catholic priest from the Order of St. Benedict, said, if I can experience God through a sunset on a mountaintop, why not through a mushroom prayerfully ingested? Look, it took 300 years for the Catholic Church to apologize to Galileo for, showing him the instruments of torture and asking him to recant that, his findings through the telescope, that the Earth wasn't at the center of the universe. I hope it's not going to take 300 years for the Catholic Church to embrace this tradition, which we think would enrich it. In fact, when you think about it, ayahuasca, but you're very familiar with, in Santo Daime and in the Union de Vegetal, these are two Catholic branches that are approved to use the use of psychedelic DMT through ayahuasca in their ceremonies. And this is approved by the Catholic Council of Bishops. So this is, yes, absolutely. And in fact, there are branches in the United States that have gotten approval to use it under the 1993 Religious Freedom Reconstruction Act, which also allows the 300,000 members of the Native American Church who follow the peyote road to use peyote. So we believe these are not ultimately contradictory, and that eventually we may see a convergence and an opening of a dialogue that will allow us to reclaim and integrate this ancient birthright into contemporary practices. We know it's happening as ayahuasca and shamanism goes global, which is what your mystery school is all about. And we also know from experimental evidence done in 1962 at Marsh Chapel on the grounds of Boston University, an experiment called The Miracle of Marsh Chapel, where Walter Pankey, a student of Timothy Leary, before Leary got booted out of Harvard, he took 20 divinity students in a chapel on a Good Friday. He gave 10 of them psilocybin. He gave 10 of them a placebo, niacin, vitamin B12, that would make them feel flushed. And 9 out of the 10, and this was a double-blind experiment. The divinity students did not know who was getting the psilocybin, who was getting the placebo. The observing researchers did not know who was getting the psilocybin and the placebo. 9 out of the 10 students, and we have this written up in a chapter in our book called The Miracle of Marsh Chapel. 9 out of the 10 divinity students had a full-blown mystical experience. Houston Smith, who became a famous scholar of religion, who was a student then, described this as the most powerful cosmic homecoming I have ever experienced. Now I have understood experientially what I've been reading about in the Bible and learning about in Catholicism for all these years. And this research provided clinical proof to the then controversial idea that psychedelics could facilitate an authentic mystical experience. There is no study in the history of religion that was better designed or had clearer conclusions than this one. And we think this is the link between why this was so fascinating for people in religions throughout the world, and certainly for the early Christians, that it could bring them into a direct experience with the divine.
Thank you so much. And so on that powerful note, I am going to conclude our intriguing conversation as we've touched upon so many different aspects of mushrooms in spirituality, religion, culture, art, and science. And so to bring it all back here, I would love to invite the audience to get to know you better. And so how might people who have heard this conversation be able to best stay in touch with you?
Oh, that's very easy, given the world of social media today. You can go to our website, psychedelicgospels.com, and there you'll see videos of Julie and me speaking. You'll find our blogs about the psychedelic renaissance, about psychedelics in religion. You will also see endorsements for our book, and you'll see some of the images of our book, and you can download the first chapter for free. So that's one place. The other place where Julie and I are very active is on Facebook. So Facebook Psychedelic Gospels page, like and follow it. And we're on there posting 2 or 3 times a week. There was recently a Gaia TV special on the Holy Mushroom that featured our work, and we'll be posting access to that as well as to the other Gaia TV series called Psychedelica, which is a very fascinating, well done, graphically illustrated, expert interviews, great music, survey of the area, different areas of psychedelics, from cannabis to DMT to ayahuasca. So we're on Pinterest, Psychedelic Gospels. We're on Instagram, Psychedelic Gospels. We're on LinkedIn under my name, Jerry B. Brown. But principally, Facebook and our website, Psychedelic Gospels, are the places that you can find us. You can join our mailing list, and we'd love to stay in touch with you as we continue our research, education, and advocacy around the use of entheogens.
Awesome. And so people can grab the first chapter of your book as a free gift. How about if I include that link down below as well?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. We'll go ahead and do that.
Our pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time and sharing your vast pool of knowledge around this beautiful mushroom. Well, several mushrooms, psilocybin and the Amanita muscaria. And so I would love to say goodbye for now and wish you a beautiful rest of your day. And I do hope to meet you again sometime, perhaps in Europe.
I'm sure that's going to happen. Thank you so much, Lorna.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Namaste.